House of the Dragon Season 2 was a mess. After a masterclass of a Season 1, Season 2 was a bit of a disappointment. So what went wrong? The season wasn't terrible, I loved a lot of it, don't get me wrong, but something clearly happened that made it such a mess. In this video, I'm gonna dive deep into all of the main characters and analyze their arcs. How did it compare to Season 1? How did it build upon Season 1? And where does it leave us with Season 3? I'll also discuss the questionable decision to shrink this season from 10 episodes to 8 episodes. So let's begin. This video is sponsored by Factor, but more on that later. First, let's talk about Rhaenyra. She has by far the most amount of screen time this season, so it's only fair she goes first. Rhaenyra is the character that suffers the most from the peculiar structure of the season. It is no secret that the decision to make the season 8 episodes instead of 10 was a poor decision. Warner Brothers insisted that it was for narrative reasons, but I don't think anyone buys that. It's pretty obvious that they wanted to save some money. Shocker. Now, usually when you take a season and decide to make it shorter, the writers will condense the story to fit the new runtime. If you look at the 7th and 8th seasons of Game of Thrones, both seasons told a complete story and didn't end abruptly. They were just vastly rushed to fit the limited runtime of the seasons. A few months before filming, Warner Brothers made the decision to change the number of episodes in the season from 10 to 8. But shortly afterwards, the writer's strike began. And when a writer's strike happens, writers can't write. So instead of condensing the 10 episode season into 8 episodes, it appears to me at least that HBO just made the first 8 episodes of the original Season 2 and called it Season 2. This is quite evident with how the season ends. If you told someone that these were the first 8 episodes of a 10 episode season, no one would blink an eye. Usually episode 9 of the season is the big battle episode, and episode 8 ended right before a big battle. But since we know the season is now over, the arc of the season is incomplete, and so are the character arcs, mainly Rhaenyra. So let's talk about how this change affected Rhaenyra. The season begins with Rhaenyra mourning the loss of her son Luke. Last season ended with this being the breaking point for Rhaenyra, and this season begins following up on that, kinda. A big theme in the Game of Thrones universe, and especially Rhaenyra, is balancing love and duty. George R.R. Martin has always said that his books were about characters constantly in conflict with themselves. Rhaenyra never wanted to be a queen, but she took on the responsibility of heir. While war rages on, Rhaenyra takes the time to grieve, and this is something that frustrates Daemon at first. The mother grieves as the queen shirks her duties. The only line Rhaenyra has in episode 1 is "I want Aemond Targaryen." In episode 2 is where her arc really starts. Rhaenyra's story this season is a lot more complex than a single arc, but if I did have to summarize her arc, it would be somewhere along the lines of taking agency in her role as queen. Rhaenyra all season is either constantly doubted or is constantly told to do nothing, and this frustrates her greatly. Rhaenyra has this extra sense of purpose because of the Song of Ice and Fire, and her being told to do nothing while others wage war for her doesn't sit well for her. Episode 2 features maybe the most prominent example of this with her husband Daemon. In the previous episode, she said, "I want Aemond Targaryen," and Daemon proceeded to take that and have a 4-year-old boy decapitated. Rhaenyra is furious about this because not only does it make her look bad, but it shows her that Daemon does not respect her. They have this big fight where Rhaenyra repeatedly asks Daemon, "Do you respect me as your queen and ruler?" and Daemon never gives her an answer and runs away to Harrenhal. Frankly, Daemon has never respected Rhaenyra, and she knows this. Emma Darcy, the actor of Rhaenyra, has repeatedly said that Rhaenyra is constantly at odds with her gender. Most of the issues she has would be resolved if she were a man, and part of that struggle is her role as a mother. If she wants to be queen during this time of war, then she has to put aside her duties of being a mother. In episode 1, she chose to be a mother, and in her absence, Daemon went behind her back and had a baby killed. In episode 2, she was almost assassinated right in her quarters, so in episode 3, we see her send her youngest children away. This is the first but small example of Rhaenyra taking action. She is choosing here to be a queen over being a mother. Episode 3 is the episode where viewers seem to grow the most frustrated with Rhaenyra. All episode, she sits around and gets ignored by her counselors, and after consulting Mysaria, the only person who seems to listen to Rhaenyra, she decides to sneak into King's Landing to speak with Alicent and sue for peace. A big argument that people had for the season was that all the women are painted as good. It's the men who are all trying to wage war, and it's the women who are trying to avoid it. What was so interesting about the women in Game of Thrones was was that so many of them were bloodthirsty and power hungry. The criticism towards House of the Dragon is that they're all always the good ones and none of them ever have any desire for power. This is most reflected in Alicent, but more on that later. I don't entirely agree with this criticism, but I do understand it, and I think the criticism exists mostly because of this scene with Alicent and Rhaenyra. The issue I took with the scene was not so much the logistics of Rhaenyra sneaking into King's Landing, although I do find it quite silly that the first 3 episodes of the season all ended with someone sneaking around. The issue I had with this was that it seemed like a small regression of Rhaenyra's character. At the end of season 1, she pondered any possibility of peace. Then her son was murdered, and she looked into the camera all furious. Come season 2, Rhaenyra is still looking to find peace even after her son was murdered. I think that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way because it came across that she didn't care as much about Luke's death. If someone murdered my son like that, especially when he was sent as a messenger, I wouldn't want peace at all. It would be bad for the realm, of course, but I would be so hungry for war. Of course, we got a whole episode of her mourning her son, but after that, she barely brings up Luke again. And same for the Greens. In the second half of the season, I don't know if Jaehaerys' death is ever mentioned. The lack of fury and motherly rage is something I think bothered a lot of people. And I especially agree with this when Rhaenyra seeking out peace one more time doesn't really tie into her arc about taking charge as queen. I think the parts of the season where her council disrespects her could really work. Maybe in a scene Rhaenyra becomes furious that she has all this built up anger because of Luke's death and no one is allowing her to express it in any way. This could be towards Mysaria or her council. Taking Luke's death and using that as a catalyst for wanting to be a more active queen would have been brilliant. So peace talks fail, fine, and then she returns in episode 4 asserting her belief that she will either become queen or die trying. What I do love though about her going to King's Landing is how everyone chastises the shit out of her for that plan, and rightfully so. The scene where the Black Council debates Rook's Rest was so close to being perfect. I love the moments with Jace telling his mother that she can't be the one to go. I even love the line from Rhaenyra where she says some may have mistaken her caution for weakness. It was great. The only thing I would change, and it's such a small change, is that Rhaenyra is the one who suggests the idea to send a dragon to Rook's Rest. Here's why. In the current show, when Rook's Rest is mentioned, Rhaenyra is like, why would they attack Rook's Rest? Then her council says they need to respond, Jace suggests they send a dragon, and then Rhaenyra agrees and offers herself. Nothing particularly wrong here, but let's rewrite this scene a bit. Rhaenyra returns, she is told about Rook's Rest, maybe a council member says it's a trap, but Rhaenyra, trying to prove herself and wanting to show her power, suggests the idea that they send a dragon. Her council will disagree with her, but Rhaenyra doesn't care. Rhaenyra can offer herself, the council will say no, and then Rhaenys can go instead. By making Rhaenyra the one who leads this plan, that means the fallout is ultimately on her. You want characters to suffer the consequences of their actions. If Rhaenyra just casually agrees they should send a dragon, it's not really her fault that they lost Rhaenys. If it was her idea, then the council can blame her, or Rhaenyra can blame herself. If you guys know me, you know I'm a big fan of characters driving the plot forward. Rhaenyra doesn't really do that for the majority of the season, and I get that's part of her arc, but I think instead of Rhaenyra making no decisions and growing tired of it, it would work better if Rhaenyra made some bad decisions and then tried to prove herself after that. I think both accomplish the same goal, but one makes Rhaenyra a bit more active. And that's the first half of the season. Rhaenyra is frustrated that she's done nothing so far in the war and looks to change that in the second half of the season. I think the latter half of the season is where people really grew frustrated with Rhaenyra, and the lack of a proper resolution to the season seems to be the biggest reason why. So episode 5 and 6 don't show Rhaenyra doing much. In episode 5, she's just chatting with everyone. In episode 6, with the help of Mysaria, she does feed the people of King's Landing, but again, that's really more of Mysaria's doing rather than Rhaenyra's. Her first attempt at actually doing something is trying to have Stefan Darkland claim a dragon, but he dies and that doesn't work. This only adds to her frustration because her council tells her that this was stupid and she's furious about it. So on the surface, it may seem like Rhaenyra doesn't do much in these episodes, but it's unfair to say that these episodes do nothing for her. In the second half of the season, the writers might be setting up something that I really like, and it has to do with the prophecy. Most fans seem to not like this inclusion into the story because they claim it robs Rhaenyra of agency. Instead of wanting the throne because it was given to her and that she likes power, she wants the throne mostly because she feels it's her duty to keep the Song of Ice and Fire alive. And I can somewhat get behind this, but in the second half of season 2, what they've kind of done is plant the seeds for this prophecy corrupting Rhaenyra, and that ties greatly into the themes of Game of Thrones. Rhaenyra feels she must uphold this prophecy and that she was chosen to do so. Well, how many people in history have used prophecy or some larger calling to commit tragedy? Throughout episode 6, Rhaenyra is being told repeatedly by Mysaria that she is worthy to be the ruler and that the gods are choosing her to rule. Rhaenyra often mentions the gods gods choosing her. And when you believe that, you can become very dangerous. People gave this scene where Rhaenyra makes out with Mysaria a bunch of crap, but when you consider the fact that Rhaenyra is likely just turned on at the fact that someone thinks she is so righteous, it makes a lot more sense. Even in the beginning of episode 3, by some miracle to her, one of the unclaimed dragons sought out a rider of his own, and this rider preaches utter devotion to Rhaenyra. It's almost as if the gods answered her prayers and just gave her a rider, because she is the chosen one. So in season 2, we've established that Rhaenyra wants to be an active participant in this war, but hasn't been. Then we also established that she believes she is the chosen one to rule the kingdoms. So come the final act of the season, the logical progression is to have her commit tragedy in the name of this prophecy. And they sort of do that. Rhaenyra brings like 30 people and says one of you can go claim a dragon. After the entire sequence, almost all of them die, but she does get 2 dragon riders out of it. So from Rhaenyra's perspective, this is a win. Sacrificing 30 to 40 people was worth it because it gives her a better chance at retaking the Iron Throne. She even ignores her son's fears and wishes because her duty to this prophecy is more important than anything. At the beginning of the season, she spent the whole episode mourning her son and shirking her duties, but come towards the end of the season, she's willingly ignoring her own son's pleas just for her destiny. All this is really nice. So what's the issue? There's no payoff. The season finale doesn't have her act in any way that pays off her new state of mind. She suggests that innocents may be killed, but we need to see action, not suggestion. I don't think it's a spoiler to say Rhaenyra will make an attempt to retake King's Landing. In this attempt, if we were to see her kill a bunch of people in her quest to retake the Iron Throne, that would be the payoff of her season-long arc. Now, I'm not talking about Daenerys level sacking where she burns down an entire city and kills 1 million people, but something on a much smaller scale where a lot of people are clearly killed. Even if we ignore the part about the prophecy, her just taking action needs to be the payoff of this season. She's felt frustrated by this all season, she went through all this trouble to get the dragon seeds, and then she doesn't even use them in the season. It's the ultimate edge from the writers, to not give us a payoff for her arc. If you look at some of the cliffhangers in this franchise, it is usually after something happens. With Jon's death, the cliffhanger is after he was killed, not when the brothers stand there with their knives in their hands. With the army of the dead blowing up the wall, the cliffhanger is after they took down the wall, not when the army showed up to the wall. A good cliffhanger is done right after something happens and we want to know what happens next. A bad cliffhanger is when nothing happens and you end the episode or season right before something is finally about to happen. And that's what happens with Rhaenyra. So overall, I don't hate Rhaenyra's arc this season. If they are going down the path of her justifying her actions in the name of prophecy, that would really work. I think it would dispel some of the criticisms that all the women in this show are good, but we just need to see the payoff of that arc, and we haven't seen it pay off yet. Before continuing on, I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Factor. Factor makes meeting your nutrition goals easier than ever by delivering fresh, never frozen, dietitian-approved meals right to your doorstep. Factor's team of gourmet chefs create each meal using only ingredients with integrity to help you feel your best all day long. Factor takes the stress out of meal planning and sets you up for success. Skip the grocery stores, prep work, and cooking fatigue. Instead, get chef-created, dietitian-approved meals delivered right to your door. With over 35 meals to choose from per week, including options like keto, calorie smart, vegan or veggie, and more. Skip the overpriced takeout trap. Factor is cheaper and way more delicious. There's nothing worse than coming home from a long day's work, having to prepare your dinner, cook it, and then clean all your pots and pans. With Factor, all you need to do is open your fridge, put your meal in the microwave for only 2 minutes, and you're ready to enjoy your restaurant quality meal. If you're someone like me who wants to spend more time watching the shows and movies we all love, or you want to spend more time watching The Goldman, then Factor is perfect for you. Head to factor75.com or click the link below and use the code thegoldman50 to get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month of orders. That's thegoldman50 at factor75.com to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month of orders. Thank you so much, Factor, for sponsoring this video. Up next, we have Alicent Hightower, and her arc was maybe the most disappointing of the season. The complaint that the women in the show are all too good mostly stems from Alicent's portrayal because they've completely turned her character around. The marketing of this show has framed Alicent and Rhaenyra as the main 2 characters, and Alicent represents the Greens. But by the end of the season, Alicent is willing to sacrifice her kids just so she can have a free life. I can't entirely blame this season because, to be fair, it was set up back in season season 1. One of the larger changes of the show was to make Alicent and Rhaenyra the same age and have them be best friends torn apart by this political system. And I think for season 1 it really worked. Both women are clearly not only victims of this political system, but the patriarchal system as well. The show clearly wants to explore the themes of how the men in their lives are holding both characters back, but I think you can still accomplish that goal without making both characters so morally righteous. Let's rewind a bit with Alicent's character and where I think it kinda went wrong. So the first half of season 1 shows Alicent having no agency with her life. She's pretty much just a political tool used by her father and the king. She's just made to push out children and she feels trapped by it. After learning of Rhaenyra's indecency, she declares herself an active participant in the Game of Thrones by wearing the green dress. Flash forward 10 years and Alicent is frankly disgusted with Rhaenyra. Since Alicent puts so much value in her virtue, Rhaenyra's lack of virtue infuriates Alicent. This is largely the reason why she pushes Aegon towards the crown, because she sees her side as virtuous and virtue must prevail. Flash forward another 5 years and tensions are still high between Alicent and Rhaenyra. All is good with Alicent's character up to this point, but then during dinner Alicent hopes that her and Rhaenyra can become friends again. Then she misinterprets Viserys and now she instills Aegon as king. Looking back on it, I think what frustrates me the most about this part of Alicent's character is I feel like they only did this because they didn't want Alicent and Rhaenyra to become enemies. They've kind of built this show around their relationship, and if the two remain enemies, then in a way that's saying the patriarchy won, that it did drive these two to opposite sides of the conflict. But since we can't have that and we need the scene where Alicent throws it all away to be free, then let's make her support for Aegon be built on a really shaky foundation, a foundation that could collapse with one conversation with Rhaenyra. Now, part of the theme of this show is that it doesn't really end up mattering who was named heir or what Viserys wanted. War will be fought and people don't care why. The third episode really highlighted this theme nicely, with the Brackens and the Blackwoods. The two hate each other for reasons they can't quite remember, and they're willing to fight in a battle that leads to thousands of deaths because of it. Rhaenys even spells out this same theme to Rhaenyra a little bit later. So I like that, and I do like how Alicent ends up saying it doesn't matter what she believed, war will still be fought. My issue just stems from the fact that Alicent is the second most important character in the show, and she turned on her own side. I think what made this show so interesting was how there were two sides to this conflict, and each side had valid claims to why they should sit the throne. But season 2 and the ending of season 1 made it pretty obvious the writers have a Team Black bias, and that's unfortunate. So since Alicent can't be a staunch Team Black supporter and she can't turn against Rhaenyra, what would they have her do? Well, how about Alicent slowly losing all her political favor she's gained, realizing all her virtue was a huge waste of time, and then that she hates her sons and is willing to turn against them. So we learn in the first episode of the season that Alicent is having sex with Kristen, already breaking down that barrier of her virtue. Then her grandson dies and she's a wreck, but she forgets about that pretty quickly and has her conversation with Rhaenyra. There she learns the truth and then starts questioning everything. She even kind of chastises Aegon for not being the wisest person in the world, which is more her fault than anything, but more on that later. So Aegon gets hurt, and then the council names Aemond regent over her. Aemond eventually removes her from court, she wanders off pondering her life, and then she betrays her family for freedom. The final shots of the season indicate this quite nicely actually. Rhaenyra has the burden of history on her shoulders while Alicent has no burdens on her shoulders anymore. I'm sorry, I don't find that to be an interesting arc. I do agree with the critics that removing all agency from Alicent wasn't a good decision. So what could they have done instead? This is where it's so tough. Without spoiling anything, all I'll say is that Alicent doesn't do much in the books anymore. After Aegon is crowned, she's just there most of the time. Now you could have her be just entirely against Rhaenyra and have her supporting her sons constantly, but I don't think that's like Alicent either. I don't think she would blindly support Aemond in his cruelty. And I do like that there was hope of rekindling her friendship with Rhaenyra. So I don't want Alicent to just do this because she hates Rhaenyra. So what could motivate Alicent so she doesn't betray her side, she has stuff to do, and she isn't hateful towards Rhaenyra either? Well, have Alicent's soft spot be Aegon. What? How could it be Aegon? Let me explain. So let's begin the series the same way. Alicent is at a council meeting and she sees Aegon bring his son into work. Instead of being frustrated by it, Alicent is glad to see he is making attempts to make sure his son is ready to rule one day. Then she also sees Aegon at court, trying to be helpful and trying to be a good leader. Clearly, Aegon isn't good at it, but she's glad that Aegon is trying. So then blood and cheese happens and Aegon's son is murdered. One of the most notable parts of the episode was when Alicent saw Aegon crying but chose not to comfort him. So in episode 3, if we really wanted to, we can keep the part where Rhaenyra tells her the truth about the Song of Ice and Fire. In episode 4, Alicent was quite cruel to Aegon. he sought her advice and she basically told him to do nothing. I want to keep this here too, because this is the second time that Alicent was quite a poor mother, and also because it is a factor in what led to Aegon wanting to fight. Aegon becomes gravely injured, and this is where the changes start happening. Alicent sees Aegon all burned and shit, and she will feel really guilty. She thinks about how she was mean to Aegon, how she didn't comfort him when Jaehaerys died, and how her neglect largely led to Aegon going off to war. She also thinks about how Aegon didn't want to rule and how she pushed him into it. Basically, she will feel really guilty and blame herself for all of Aegon's suffering. When Aegon calls out for Alicent, she will hear it and turn back and be there for Aegon. Part of the tension for the rest of the season is the growing influence of Aemond. Since Alicent suspects what Aemond really did to Aegon, she's very protective of Aegon and fearful of Aemond. She can still have her panic attack when Aemond is named regent, and she can still be removed from court as well. So Alicent has every reason to fear Aemond right now. I don't think it's her betraying her side of her family if she's fearful of Aemond. In the original season, she just turned against all her sons. If she's fearful of Aemond because she's so protective of Aegon, the actual king, that works a lot better. So she can still wander off thinking about what to do now that she has no power, and here's how the season will end differently. Alicent goes to Rhaenyra and talks about surrendering. Her stipulation is that Aegon gets to live the rest of his days out in Essos or something. Rhaenyra says she cannot do this and that she needs to put Aegon's head to the sword if she were to win this war. This is where the change will happen. Instead of Alicent agreeing like a terrible mother, she tells Rhaenyra to fuck off. Maybe she can notice that Rhaenyra is a bit more power hungry. I'm also gonna do another small rewrite here. Earlier in the season when Alicent is talking to Helaena about the death of Jaehaerys, Helaena can tell Alicent that the killer said a son for a son. So Alicent knows what this means. When she talks to Rhaenyra and hears Rhaenyra say a son for a son again, this sparks something in Alicent that really makes her think Rhaenyra was behind the death of her grandson. This is the breaking point for Alicent. She tells Rhaenyra to fuck off and that she will not give up her son. Rhaenyra then imprisons Alicent and the relationship is not on great terms. So the season ends with Alicent imprisoned, something that does happen in the books but doesn't appear to be happening in the show, and Aegon is away safe for the time being. I know this arc is quite different than the one we did get, but frankly this whole arc about Alicent wanting to be free from court is just not an arc I find interesting at all. It could potentially work if you tied her and Aegon into it. Maybe she regrets making Aegon king and she just wants her son to be safe. But either way, I think this change for Alicent makes her a more active character and one that doesn't turn on her family. Overall, those are my thoughts on Alicent. I didn't really like her arc this season, and I hope they can somewhat backtrack that in season 3. Up next, we have Daemon, and Daemon is the one who is closest to having a complete character arc, but there are a few things I wasn't too big on. What made Daemon such an intriguing character in season 1 was that he was so hard to pin down. He was always willing to go out of his way to get what he wanted, but he also had a soft spot for his brother and that relationship. Daemon begins the season with the supposed green light from Rhaenyra to seek justice. Daemon sneaks into King's Landing, hires a rat catcher and a gold cloak to kill Aemond Targaryen. However, when asked what they should do if they cannot find Aemond, he supposedly says a son for a son. Blood and Cheese, the name of the killers, go on to kill a 4-year-old boy, and this infuriates Rhaenyra. When Rhaenyra calls Daemon out on his bullshit, he runs away to Harrenhal. I love these first 2 episodes for Daemon. His arc this season is about finally committing to Rhaenyra. After season-long questions about whether or not he would turn on Rhaenyra and potentially seek the throne for himself, he pushes that all aside and declares his allegiance along with the allegiance of the entire army he amassed to Rhaenyra. Part of this arc I absolutely loved, and another part of it I found a bit unnecessary. So the parts that I loved had anything to do with relating to the pain he had caused to others. Whenever he had a vision of Rhaenyra or Helaena or Viserys, those moments really worked for me. Moments where Daemon was forced to confront all the terrible things he had done. Since Daemon is someone who loves to run away when things get tough, being forced to confront these memories is something that's challenging for him. The scene where he hugs a grieving Viserys and tells him that he's there for him was so powerful. It shows how much that scene from the pilot episode really haunted Daemon. I also really liked how while all these visions are going on, he's having to learn proper diplomacy from the River Lords. We all know his first move is to just threaten people into doing what he wants, but for maybe the first time in his life, that doesn't work. The Brackens don't cave, and this surprises Daemon. So then he proceeds to ask Willem to commit war crimes, and this, to his surprise, comes back to bite him in the ass when all the River Lords chastise chastise him. What does Daemon usually do in a situation like this? Run away. But here he is forced to hear the Riverlords out, and he struggles with that. Towards the end of the season, he finds himself at the mercy of Oscar Tully. Oscar is not afraid of Daemon, and he essentially orders Daemon to kill Willem, and Daemon listens. I think this moment was to highlight how uncomfortable Daemon is when he is not in control. The reason he is always running away is because when he doesn't have control, he leaves. And here he had no control, and he had to execute Willem. I do think that Daemon should have at least had one vision of his first wife, Rhea Royce, because he did kill her with a rock, so that probably should have been something he confronted as well. I do also wish there was a moment where Daemon apologized to Rhaenyra. I know he declares himself to her, which is nice, but I think an apology would have paid off some of those scenes a lot more. But overall, anything that had to do with Daemon confronting his past, I really liked. The parts of his arc I didn't care for were anything with him pondering if he wants the Iron Throne or not. I thought a lot of these questions were answered in season 1. I never got the vibe that Daemon wanted the Iron Throne, and in the season finale, he was the one who bent the knee and crowned Rhaenyra. So the season-long question about whether or not Daemon would use his army he amassed to pursue the Iron Throne himself was never something that compelled me. The conversations where people repeatedly called him Prince or King Consort I did find hilarious, and you can tell it kind of bothered Daemon, but he never really corrected them. Maybe it's just because I know the events of the entire show, and I know he isn't going to turn his back on Rhaenyra, but readdressing this question that I felt was already answered in season 1 was a waste of time for me. The other part of this arc that I wasn't too fond of was his vision of the future. Was it cool to see Daenerys and White Walkers? Sure. The purpose of this vision was to give Daemon extra purpose. Last season, he said dreams didn't make us kings, dragons did. And now here he is saying winter is coming. It's a pretty neat transition for his character, but all season long when he was having visions, not once did it have to do with the Song of Ice and Fire. His purpose was either going to be getting the Iron Throne for himself or supporting Rhaenyra. To have Daemon have a vision of the White Walkers last second and have that be a big reason for Daemon's devotion for Rhaenyra was such a cop-out. As I alluded to this earlier, his purpose should come from all the guilt he has had about his actions towards Rhaenyra and wanting to make up for it. Giving Daemon a vision of the future, a vision we all know kinda falls flat anyway, didn't do it for me. One part of the arc they might be hinting at, and if so I love it, is Daemon and Rhaenyra kinda switching personalities. Daemon has always been the brash and headstrong character, while Rhaenyra was patient and thought her actions through. But both characters are starting to turn into the other person a bit. I think next season we're gonna get a much more reserved Daemon, one that listens to Rhaenyra, one that is patient, and one that is more willing to defer to Rhaenyra. Rhaenyra, on the other hand, might become a bit more like Daemon. She clearly wants to take more action, and her patience is running thin. And if the writers do take her down this arc where her faith in herself leads to her doing terrible things, that could be like Daemon. Daemon was obviously a lot more selfish about it, but maybe Rhaenyra grows to that point. We'll just have to wait and see. Of all the characters, I think Daemon was the least hurt by the shortened season. He had a complete arc. I loved half of it, but I didn't love the other half. Aegon was a huge surprise for me this season because I loved almost everything about his character. The way they turned this twerp from the first season into one of the more compelling characters in the show was a pleasure to watch. One thing that should be said right off the bat is that some frankly terrible decisions made in season 1 hindered Aegon in season 2. If you just watched this season, then you would think of Aegon as a silly guy. He means well, but he's not fit to rule at all. And if you watched most of his scenes in season 1, this clearly makes sense. He never wanted to be king. He wanted to live his life and just have fun doing it. But season 1 decided to do two things with the character that really annoyed me. One is to have Aegon assault women, and the other is to have him supporting the child fighting pits. These two actions make Aegon irredeemable in a way. It's a story, so anyone can be redeemed in a certain light, but when you know so little about this character and then you have him doing this, it's not a great look. The reason I bring this up is because the story would be so much better off if Aegon wasn't a cruel person, because there's nothing in season 2 to suggest that he's cruel. And if you think Aegon was cruel to Aemond, then I'm sorry, but you're soft. Sure, he was a little mean, but let's be real, he wasn't cruel to Aemond. But let's put the season 1 blunders to the side and dive deep into Aegon's arc. So when we meet Aegon this season, he seems so filled with energy and joy. I loved the inclusion of Aegon bringing his son to the council with him. When you consider all his insecurities he had about his father, it makes sense that Aegon would want to be a better father to Jaehaerys. Viserys, or frankly anyone, never taught Aegon how to rule rule, so Aegon is gonna attempt to teach his son how to rule. Then we see him in court, and of course his incompetence was highlighted. But he does deserve some brownie points. The way he mentions how they're only gonna win the war with the effort of the small folk was nice, and how he initially agreed to give this one guy his taxes back showed that he does have a heart. So these moments in the first episode I really liked. Then his son gets killed and Aegon is devastated. Even though he is the king, Aegon might be the most sympathetic character in the show. That's why I'm so annoyed at those decisions made in season 1, because now I seem like a bad guy for saying I sympathize with Aegon. So Aegon is devastated by the death of his son, and I love him in the council scene. I love how the calculated Otto Hightower wants to use this tragedy as a propaganda piece, and Aegon is just like, no, I don't want my dead son paraded through the streets. That's such a human thing to say. Episode 2 is when we really start to see what Aegon's flaws are. Since he knows he isn't really fit to be king, he's so insecure about looking weak. And this is what I mean when I say he's a victim. He never wanted to be king, and he was never even prepared for it. Now that he's thrust into a role he was never prepared for, he's getting insulted because of his incompetence, his family is dying because he's king, and when he tries to prove himself, he becomes a cripple. It makes perfect sense that Aegon would have all the rat catchers killed. He wants to look strong. And when he was chatting with Otto, even though everything Otto said was true, I couldn't help but feel bad when he told Aegon, your father was right about you. That must have been so devastating for Aegon to hear. And then at the end of the episode when his mother refuses to comfort him, it was so sad. Deep down, Aegon just wants approval and affection, and he never gets it. So the next 2 episodes, Aegon continues to be insecure about his strength. He's easily manipulated by Larys, and then in episode 4, he's embarrassed by Aemond in his council. Frankly, he did have it coming because of the way he treated Aemond in the previous episode, but again, that doesn't mean Aegon is cruel. So after being embarrassed in front of his council, embarrassed by his mother, and embarrassed by his grandfather, Aegon tries to do something and flies off to war, where he is betrayed by his own brother and almost dies because of it. Aegon is by no means a perfect dude, but all this pain and suffering was inflicted upon him by his elders. He never wanted any of it, but he was literally dragged into this position. And now that he's broken beyond belief, not even his mother is there to comfort him. I think this is why Alicent's betrayal at the end of the season pissed off so many people, because she was the one who put Aegon in this position. She never tried to teach him how to properly rule, and then after he tried his best, his execution was signed off by his mother. The second half of the season doesn't have Aegon doing much. He's just sitting there in his misery and pain. The season ends and Aegon is pissed. He's being dragged away and you can see that rage in his eyes. Frankly, if I was him, I would be furious at everyone too. Look at what they all put upon him and look what it all led to. Aegon was by far the biggest surprise of the season. They turned him into this deeply flawed and broken man, and I cannot wait to see what they do with him in season 3. Before continuing on with the rest of this video, only 7.6% of viewers are subscribed to this channel. So if you're enjoying this video, please consider subscribing for more content like this. Thank you. Jace was another character in season 2 that was a big standout for me. In season 1, he barely did anything, not at the fault of his own, but of the younger characters, more emphasis was put on Lucerys since he was the one that was gonna get killed. I think what they did with Jace this season was masterfully build upon his insecurity as a bastard. In season 1, episode 6, there's that one scene where young Jace asks his mother if he is a bastard, and that was really the biggest scene Jace had all season. But now that Jace has a more prominent role, we get to see more of how his true identity affects him. So Jace knows he's a bastard, but he also knows that he is the supposed heir to the Iron Throne after Rhaenyra. Seeing how there is currently a war being fought over the line of succession is something that unquestionably scares him. If a war is being fought because his mother was a woman, then a war can surely be fought over Jace being a bastard. So how does Jace deal with this insecurity? Well, by stepping up. Considering how little experience he has, Jace is surprisingly good at diplomacy. So he begins the series going far north and negotiating with the Starks. I would have loved to have seen more of this, but I get there's only so much you can cover. This mission was an unquestioned success, but because of Luke's death, Rhaenyra is now scared to have Jace go off on missions again because of what might happen. So for the next few episodes, Jace just hangs around Dragonstone doing nothing. I love how his frustration with doing nothing is similar to his mother's, but it stems from a different place. Rhaenyra is tired of doing nothing because as a queen, she needs to seem strong. Jace is tired of doing nothing because if he does nothing, then people may look at him as nothing more than a bastard. If Jace wants to rule the Seven Kingdoms one day, then he needs to do more than be Rhaenyra's firstborn child. He needs to be a leader, someone people respect and fear. In episode 4, when Rhaenyra returns from King's Landing, we really get to see Jace take charge for the first time. He questions his mother about where the hell she had been, and then when Rhaenyra agrees that they need to send a dragon to Rook's Rest, he volunteers himself. Of course, he is denied and this frustrates him. So come the second half of the season, we start to see a lot more of Jace. First, he disrespects his mother's wishes and flies off to the twins to get passing for the Starks. This scene was another another example of how good at diplomacy Jace is. He returns home and Rhaenyra is both pleased with Jace and annoyed with him. The whole dragon seed situation was such a brilliant way to highlight Jace's insecurities. So at first Jace suggests finding noble-born people to claim dragons, but after that doesn't work, Rhaenyra turns to finding an army of bastards to claim dragons. The scene where Jace begs his mother not to follow through with this was one of the best scenes of the series. If all these bastards claim dragons, then what makes Jace special? He's put so much of his identity into being a dragon rider, and that is threatened if other bastards ride dragons too. It doesn't matter that Rhaenyra named Jace her heir. Viserys named Rhaenyra his heir, and look how that turned out. And then afterwards, seeing Jace confront Ulf was great as well. It's his way of asserting himself and separating himself from the bastards. Jace doesn't really have a complete arc this season, but he didn't need one. Simply seeing his development was great. I can totally see him in the future trying to go above and beyond to prove himself, and it may cost him. We'll have to wait and see. Jace and Aegon were probably the two standout characters for me this season. Their development was subtle but effective. I want to spend some time talking about Aemond. Even though he is in the season quite a bit, he doesn't really have much character development. Early in the season, he shared some regret about what happened with Luke, and that was a really neat insight into his character. I did really like the scene where he told Sylvie that he was honored that Daemon tried to have him killed. In a way, Aemond's motivation is very similar to Aegon's. He doesn't want to look weak. Now, unlike Aegon, Aemond's insecurities stem from all the supposed bullying he received when he was younger. In season 1, I think this really worked well. We didn't really see him as some power-hungry tyrant, just a dude trying to prove how great and tough he was. He thought he could taunt Luke because he was capable of taming the largest dragon in the world, but then things went wrong and it shook him. In season 2, his arc is pretty much getting teased by Aegon again, embarrassing Aegon in front of the small council, and then taking the opportunity to kill Aegon. This resulted in him being Prince Regent and growing even more power hungry. It's hard to elaborate on this arc for Aemond because I think it's incomplete, but because there's more to this story. So in episode 7, we see Aemond is terrified for the first time, looking upon Rhaenyra's new dragon army. In response to this, Aemond is trying to get Helaena to join because she has a dragon as well. But then he talks to her and she scares the shit out of him yet again. Season 3 seems to be going in the direction of Aemond losing so much of that power. Rhaenyra is going to try to take King's Landing while Aemond is not there. How will Aemond respond to this? We saw he burned an entire city. Is he going to do this again? I think season 3 will give Aemond a lot to do now that he will potentially be out of power. I wouldn't say I disliked anything that happened with Aemond this season. This is just the beginning of a potential arc, and I'm curious to see where it goes. Helaena is the last character I want to talk about. Now, you may think it's strange I'm devoting a section to her when she doesn't really do much this season, but I think her portrayal is indicative of a larger issue I've had with the season. So in the first episode, Helena's son is murdered right in front of her. A lot of people debated the logistics of how this scene played out and how it was different from the books, but I really didn't mind the changes. What I did mind was how the character was treated afterwards. In the episode following the death of Jaehaerys, Helaena was visibly distraught. But after that episode, we never see her even remotely upset again. Like, she had one conversation with Alicent where she said she was upset, and that was that. This season, for me at least, had an issue with how characters grieved. It's like there's this tragic event, in the next episode the characters are devastated, and then in the episode after that, everyone is back to normal. I mentioned this before, but Luke is almost never mentioned again after the first episode. And I think in the entire second half of the season, the death of Jaehaerys was only mentioned once, and it was to Daemon. The point I'm trying to make is that I don't think this show treats these tragic events with the weight they should be treated with. Helaena watched her son die and she doesn't seem to really care. People bring up the point that Helaena is likely autistic and would show her emotions differently, and that may be true, but I don't get the vibe that was what the writers were going for. Like in the final episode, Helaena is gladly entering Daemon's visions and playing into it. This all goes back to the complaint I shared earlier about the women in this show. It's almost as if the show is too scared to show the women being emotional because of the stereotype that women are too emotional. I wish Rhaenyra and Alicent used the death of their son and grandson respectively as something that fueled their eagerness to win the war. I know it's different from the books, but how thematically rich would it have been if the death of her son turned Helaena, the most innocent character in the series, into someone so hateful and filled with rage? Or have it completely destroy her mentally to show how innocent people are hurt by the actions the characters make in this show? That's all I really have to say about Helaena. Her visions and dreams were cool and all, I just wish her depiction this season was a bit more realistic. And those are my thoughts on House of the Dragon Season 2. I know I missed a few characters, but I wanted to focus this video on the main characters. What did you think about this season of House of the Dragon? Let me know down below. If you want to see more of me talking about Game of Thrones, check out my retrospective on Game of Thrones Season 8 5 years later. Thank you everyone so much for watching another one of my videos. Don't forget to unite the Claude Squad, and I will see you guys next time.